Alpha King returned to the fortress early. His Luna whispered, "Stay quiet." The reason was shocking. The winter wind howled through the stone corridors of Blackthorn Fortress, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant snow. King Marcus Blackthorn dismounted his warhorse in the courtyard 3 days earlier than expected, his dark cloak billowing behind him as he strode toward the main keep. The diplomatic mission to the Northern Territories had concluded faster than anticipated, and he found himself eager to return to his wife, Queen Elena. The fortress stood imposing against the gray December sky, its towers reaching toward the clouds like ancient sentinels. Marcus had built this stronghold with his own hands alongside his father, stone by stone, creating a sanctuary for his people in the harsh wilderness of the American frontier. The walls were thick, designed to withstand both the brutal winters and any military assault. Arrow slits dotted the exterior, and the battlements were manned day and night by his most trusted guards. Now, as he approached the heavy oak doors, something felt different. The usual bustle of servants and guards seemed muted, almost deliberately quiet. He pushed open the door to find the great hall nearly empty, save for a few servants who startled at his entrance. Their eyes widened with surprise before they quickly bowed and scattered like leaves in the wind. Marcus frowned, his warrior instincts immediately alert. Where was everyone? Where was Elena? The great hall, normally filled with the sounds of daily life, servants preparing meals, guards changing shifts, nobles discussing matters of state, was eerily silent. The massive fireplace at the far end crackled with flames, but the warmth seemed unable to penetrate the strange atmosphere that had settled over his home. Marcus's boots echoed on the stone floor as he crossed the hall, his hand instinctively resting on the pommel of his sword. Years of military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming that something was amiss. He noticed details that seemed out of place. A servant's cart abandoned in a corner, a half-eaten meal on one of the tables, a tapestry hanging slightly askew, as if someone had brushed past it in a hurry. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's see what King Marcus discovers. Taking the stone stairs 2 at a time, Marcus made his way toward the royal chambers. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the distant howl of the wind outside. His hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword as he navigated the familiar corridors. The torches along the walls cast dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own, and Marcus found himself remembering childhood stories of ghosts and spirits that his old nurse used to tell. He shook his head, dismissing such thoughts. Whatever was happening here had nothing to do with the supernatural, and everything to do with the very real world of politics and power. When he reached the heavy wooden door to his private quarters, he heard it, a soft murmur of voices, barely audible through the thick oak. Marcus paused, his hand on the door handle, listening intently. The voices were female, multiple women speaking in hushed, urgent tones. He couldn't make out the words, but the intensity of the conversation was unmistakable. His mind raced through possibilities. Was Elena in danger? Had something happened while he was away? Was there a threat within his own fortress? Marcus turned the handle slowly, pushing the door open just enough to slip inside. The hinges, well-oiled and maintained, made no sound. What he saw made him freeze in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. Elena stood in the center of their chamber, her golden hair cascading down her back like a waterfall of sunlight. She wore a simple dress of deep blue wool, practical rather than ornate, and her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows as if she had been engaged in physical labor. But she wasn't alone. Surrounding her were at least 20 women, servants in their plain gray dresses, noble women in finer fabrics, even the fortress cook still wearing her flour-dusted apron, all gathered in a tight circle. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones, passing something between them that Marcus couldn't quite see from his position by the door. His wife's back was to him, her posture tense with concentration. Her hands moved with quick, efficient gestures as she directed the women around her, pointing to different areas of the room and giving silent instructions. The women moved with practiced coordination, suggesting this was not the first time they had gathered like this. Marcus watched, fascinated and confused, as bundles wrapped in cloth passed from hand to hand in a carefully orchestrated chain. Just as Marcus was about to announce his presence, Elena's head tilted slightly, and without turning around, she raised one hand in a subtle gesture. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but carried an unmistakable authority that made every woman in the room freeze in place. "Stay quiet." Marcus obeyed instinctively, years of trust in his wife's judgment overriding his confusion. He pressed himself against the wall near the door, partially concealed by a heavy tapestry that depicted his family's coat of arms. From this vantage point, he could observe without being seen, and he watched as the scene unfolded before him. The women, after a moment of stillness, continued their work with even greater urgency. Now, he could see more clearly what they were doing. They were passing bundles, small packages wrapped in cloth and tied with twine, from one to another, creating a careful chain that led to a large trunk in the corner of the room. "That's the last of them," whispered Margaret, the head housekeeper, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she placed a final bundle into the trunk. Margaret had served the Blackthorne family for 30 years, and Marcus had never seen her look so nervous. 50 families will eat well this winter because of this. Elena nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "And Lord Ashford's tax collectors?" "They left an hour ago," replied Sarah, one of the younger noble women, daughter of Lord Pemberton, who controlled the Eastern Territories. "They counted the grain stores in the main warehouse and found everything in order. They have no idea about the secondary stores we've been hiding." Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. Tax collectors? Secondary stores? His mind raced as he pieced together what he was witnessing. Lord Ashford was his appointed regional administrator, responsible for collecting taxes and managing resources for the kingdom. But something was clearly amiss if Elena was hiding supplies from his own officials. Why would his wife need to conceal anything from men acting under his authority? "The families in the lower village were on the brink of starvation," Elena continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Ashford's men took triple the agreed amount last month, claiming it was the king's orders. But I know my husband. Marcus would never authorize such cruelty. He would never condemn innocent families to starve while grain rots in warehouses." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He felt as if someone had driven a fist into his stomach, forcing the air from his lungs. He had given Ashford authority to collect reasonable taxes to maintain the fortress and support the military. Triple the amount? That would leave the villagers with barely enough to survive the harsh winter. The American frontier was unforgiving at the best of times, but winter here was particularly brutal. Temperatures could drop so low that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Snow could pile up higher than a man's head, trapping families in their homes for weeks at a time. Without adequate food stores, people would die. It was that simple and that terrible. "Your Majesty, you've risked so much," said Catherine, the fortress cook, her eyes glistening with tears. Catherine was a large woman with strong arms from years of kneading bread and stirring massive pots of stew. She had fed Marcus since he was a boy, and he had never seen her cry. "If Lord Ashford discovers what you've done—" "He won't," Elena interrupted firmly. "We've been careful. The grain we've redistributed came from my personal dowry stores, not the king's reserves. Legally, it's mine to do with as I please. But Ashford has spies everywhere, which is why we must maintain absolute secrecy. One word in the wrong ear, and everything we've worked for could be destroyed." Marcus watched as his wife moved through the group, placing a reassuring hand on each woman's shoulder. In that moment, he saw her not just as his queen, but as a leader in her own right. Brave, compassionate, and willing to risk her position to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She moved with a grace that belied the tension of the situation. offering comfort and strength to each woman in turn. Some of them were crying softly. Others looked terrified. But all of them looked to Elena with expressions of absolute trust and devotion. "What about the records?" asked Margaret, her voice quavering slightly. "Ashford keeps meticulous accounts. He has clerks who track every grain of wheat, every pound of flour. If there's a discrepancy..." Elena moved to a small desk in the corner and retrieved a leather-bound ledger. The book was thick, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. "I've kept my own records. Every grain of wheat, every pound of dried meat, every vegetable from the winter stores, all documented. I've noted the date, the quantity, the recipient, and the reason for distribution. When the time is right, when Marcus returns, I'll present him with the evidence of Ashford's corruption." "And if he doesn't believe you?" Sarah's voice was small, frightened. She was young, barely 20, and this was clearly her first experience with anything so dangerous. Elena's laugh was soft but confident. "My husband is many things. A warrior, a king, sometimes stubborn as a mule. But he is not blind to injustice. He will see the truth. I know him better than anyone in this world, and I know that when he understands what has been happening, he will act swiftly and decisively." Marcus felt warmth spread through his chest at her words, even as anger continued to simmer beneath the surface. She knew him so well, trusted him so completely. But he also felt anger rising, anger at Ashford for abusing his position, anger at himself for not seeing the signs before he left, anger at the system that had allowed such corruption to flourish unchecked. "Now," Elena said, her voice taking on a more businesslike tone. "We need to distribute these supplies before nightfall. Margaret, you'll take the cart to the lower village. Use the forest road, not the main path. If anyone stops you, you're delivering linens for the winter. The supplies are hidden beneath the cloth in the false bottom we constructed. Catherine, the upper farms need these medical supplies. I've included herbs for fever and infection, bandages, and the salve that old Martha makes for frostbite. Sarah, you'll accompany me to the widow Morrison's cottage. Her children have been ill, and she's too proud to ask for help." The women began to move with practiced efficiency, clearly having done this before. This wasn't a one-time act of charity, Marcus realized. This was an organized operation, carefully planned and executed multiple times. How long had this been going on? How had he not known? He prided himself on being aware of everything that happened within his domain, yet this entire network had been operating right under his nose. As the women filed out through a side door that led to a servant's staircase, each carrying their assigned bundles, Elena remained behind. She stood before the window, her silhouette framed by the gray winter light that filtered through the glass. Marcus saw her shoulders sag with exhaustion, the confident posture she had maintained for the other women finally giving way to the weight of what she had been carrying. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, and he heard her whisper to herself, "Please let him understand. Please let him come home soon. I can't do this alone much longer." Marcus couldn't remain silent any longer. He stepped forward, his boots making no sound on the thick carpet that covered the stone floor, and spoke softly. "I'm home, Elena." She spun around, her hand flying to her chest, eyes wide with shock. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, Marcus feared she might faint. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then her expression shifted through a rapid succession of emotions: surprise, fear, relief, and finally, determination. He watched the transformation, saw her spine straighten and her chin lift, saw the queen emerge once more from behind the exhausted woman. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Long enough," Marcus replied, moving closer. "Long enough to hear about Ashford's treachery. Long enough to see what you've been doing. Long enough to understand why you asked me to stay quiet. Long enough to be both proud and furious in equal measure." Elena lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. Her blue eyes, the color of a summer sky, were filled with defiance and determination. I won't apologize for helping our people. I'm not asking you to. Marcus closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. They were cold, he noticed, and trembling slightly despite her outward composure. I'm asking you to tell me everything, from the beginning, every detail, every decision, every risk you've taken. I need to understand the full scope of what's been happening in my absence. She searched his face, looking for anger or disappointment, but found only concern and love. Slowly she nodded and led him to sit by the fireplace. The chairs were positioned close together, an intimate arrangement they had established early in their marriage when they would sit and talk for hours about everything and nothing. As the flames crackled and danced, casting warm light across the room and creating patterns of shadow and light on the walls, Elena began to speak. It started 2 months ago, shortly after you left for the Northern Territories. Lord Ashford arrived with his collectors, claiming you had sent new orders to increase tax collection by 300% to fund a new military campaign. I knew immediately something was wrong. You had mentioned no such campaign, and you would have discussed it with me before leaving. We've always made decisions together, especially ones that would affect our people so dramatically. Marcus's jaw clenched, the muscles in his face tightening with barely controlled rage. I gave no such orders. There is no military campaign. The Northern mission was purely diplomatic, establishing trade agreements and reinforcing alliances. I know, but Ashford had documents, official-looking papers with what appeared to be your seal. The wax was the right color, the impression looked authentic, and the paper bore the royal watermark. The village elders had no choice but to comply. They're simple people, Marcus. They don't have the knowledge to detect a forged seal, and they trust that documents bearing the king's mark are legitimate. Within a week, families who had been comfortable were suddenly destitute. The Hendersons lost all their grain stores. 3 generations of careful saving, gone. The Millers had to slaughter their breeding livestock just to pay the tax, which means they'll have no animals to rebuild their herd come spring. Old Thomas, the blacksmith, collapsed from exhaustion trying to produce enough tools to meet the quota Ashford imposed. She paused, her eyes distant with the memory, and Marcus could see tears beginning to form. I went to the villages myself to assess the damage. I took a simple cloak and went without guards, because I needed to see the truth without the filter of official reports. What I saw broke my heart, Marcus. Children crying from hunger, their bellies swollen from malnutrition. Mothers rationing their own food to feed their babies, growing thinner and weaker by the day. Men too proud to ask for help, watching their families suffer while they tried desperately to find work, to earn enough to replace what had been taken. I saw a little girl, maybe 5 years old, fighting with her brother over a crust of bread. A single crust of bread, Marcus, in our kingdom, under our protection. Why didn't you send word to me? Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. I tried. 3 times I sent messengers to find you. The first was young William, the stable master's son. He was eager to help, brave and loyal. He never returned. The second was Sir Robert, one of your knights who had remained at the fortress. He came back 2 weeks later, beaten and robbed, claiming he had been attacked by bandits on the northern road. But I noticed his injuries were too precise, too calculated. They were the work of professionals, not random thieves. The third messenger was my own lady's maid, Clara. She was clever and resourceful, and I thought she might succeed where the others had failed. She returned with a message from Ashford's men, a warning that any further interference would be considered treason against the crown. Marcus felt rage building inside him, hot and fierce. It burned in his chest like a living thing, demanding release. He threatened you? Not directly. He's too clever for that. The message was delivered by one of his captains, a man named Garrett, who has a reputation for cruelty. He came to the fortress under the pretense of a courtesy call, brought me flowers and wine, and made pleasant conversation. But as he was leaving, he mentioned how unfortunate it would be if the queen were to have an accident, how the kingdom would mourn if something were to happen to me while the king was away, how important it was that I focus on my duties as a wife and leave matters of state to those appointed to handle them. The threat was clear, even if the words were polite. Stay out of his way, or there would be consequences. Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out over the fortress grounds. But I couldn't just stand by and watch our people starve. Every night, I would lie in this bed, in this room we share, and I would think about those children crying from hunger. I would think about the mothers making impossible choices about which child to feed. I would think about the men watching their life's work being stripped away by corrupt officials, and I knew I had to do something, so I started planning. She returned to the desk and retrieved the ledger she had shown the women earlier, placing it in Marcus's hands. The leather was worn from frequent handling, and the pages were filled with columns of numbers and detailed notes. My dowry included substantial stores, grain, preserved meats, medical supplies, cloth, tools. When we married, your father insisted that I maintain control of these resources, that they remain legally mine rather than becoming property of the crown. At the time, I thought it was just a formality, a way to ensure I would have some independence. Now I realize it was a gift beyond measure. Legally, these belonged to me personally, not to the crown. I realized I could use them to help the villages without technically breaking any laws. Ashford couldn't accuse me of stealing from the royal stores because I was using my own property. Marcus opened the ledger, scanning the meticulous entries. Every transaction was documented with extraordinary detail. Dates, quantities, recipients, purposes, and even notes about the condition of the families receiving aid. It was the work of someone who knew they might need to defend their actions in a court of law, someone who understood that documentation could mean the difference between being seen as a hero or a criminal. But I couldn't do it alone, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. I needed help, and I needed discretion. So I approached the women, servants, noblewomen, anyone I could trust. I started with Margaret, because she's been with your family for decades, and I knew her loyalty was absolute. Then Catherine, because she sees everyone who comes and goes from the kitchens, and would know which families were suffering most. Then Sarah, because her father controls the Eastern Territories, and she has access to information from beyond our immediate domain. She paused, and a small smile crossed her face. Do you know what happened when I told them what I wanted to do? Not one of them hesitated. Not one asked about the risks to themselves. They simply asked what needed to be done and how they could help. We created a network, a secret system of distribution. We moved supplies at night, used hidden routes through the forest that only the locals know. We kept separate records, created false inventories, and developed signals to warn each other if Ashford's men were nearby. The women you saw today are just a few of the many who have been helping. There are at least 40 women involved in this network, spread across all levels of society. This is extraordinary, Marcus murmured, still reading through the ledger. The scope of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of transactions, thousands of pounds of supplies, all moved and distributed with military precision. The organization, the risk you've taken, the sheer audacity of operating this right under Ashford's nose. I had no choice. Elena interrupted, her voice passionate. She moved to stand in front of him, her hands gripping the arms of his chair. These are our people, Marcus. They trust us to protect them, to ensure their welfare. That's the bargain we make when we accept the crown. We receive their loyalty and service, and in return, we safeguard their lives and livelihoods. When Ashford betrayed that trust, when he used your name to justify his cruelty, Someone had to act. You weren't here, so it had to be me. I couldn't sit in this comfortable room, wearing fine dresses and eating rich food, while children starved in the villages below. I couldn't be that kind of queen. Marcus set the ledger aside and pulled Elena into his arms, holding her tightly. He could feel her trembling, could feel the tension that had been building for months finally beginning to release. You are remarkable, brave and brilliant and everything a queen should be. You've done more than I could have imagined, taken risks that make my blood run cold to think about. But why the secrecy? Why not confront Ashford directly? You could have called a council, presented your concerns to the nobles, demanded an investigation. Elena pulled back slightly to look at him, and he saw the calculation in her eyes, the strategic thinking that had allowed her to operate successfully for so long. Because I have no proof of his corruption that would stand up in a formal challenge. The documents he carries bear your seal. Forged, I'm certain, but expertly done. I've examined them myself, and even I can barely detect the differences. The wax is the right composition, the paper is authentic royal stock, and the handwriting is a perfect imitation of your scribe's work. If I had accused him publicly without ironclad evidence, it would have been my word against his. And as a woman, even as queen, my word might not have been enough. She stood and began to pace, her mind clearly working through the political calculations she had been making for months. Think about it, Marcus. Ashford is a man, a noble with connections and allies throughout the kingdom. He has served the crown for years and has a reputation for efficiency and loyalty. I am a woman, a foreigner who married into the Blackthorn line. There are nobles who still question whether a woman should have any voice in governance. If I had made a public accusation without absolute proof, Ashford could have turned it against me. He could have claimed I was hysterical, emotional, that I was overstepping my bounds. He could have suggested that I was the one acting against your interests, that I was trying to undermine your appointed officials. In the court of public opinion, who do you think would have been believed? Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the truth of her words. The political landscape was treacherous, and gender politics made it even more so. You're right. God help me, you're right. If you had moved too quickly, you could have destroyed your own credibility. Exactly. So I needed time to gather evidence, to document everything, to build an unassailable case. I needed to create a record so detailed, so thoroughly corroborated, that no one could dismiss it. That's what this ledger represents. Months of careful documentation, witness statements, physical evidence of Ashford's crimes. But there's something else, Marcus. Something I haven't told you yet. Marcus stood, moving to stand beside her. What is it? Elena hesitated, and he could see the fear in her eyes. Whatever she was about to reveal, it frightened her more than anything else she had shared. Ashford isn't working alone. I believe he's part of a larger conspiracy, something that extends far beyond simple corruption or personal greed. Over the past weeks, I've been receiving reports from the other women in the network, women whose families have connections across the kingdom. And I've noticed a pattern. Other regional administrators are implementing similar policies. Excessive taxation, threats against those who complain, mysterious disappearances of messengers. It's happening in the Western Territories under Lord Blackwood's jurisdiction, in the southern provinces under Duke Ravencroft's control, even in some of the northern settlements you just visited. You think someone is coordinating this, Marcus said, the pieces falling into place in his mind. I think someone is trying to destabilize the kingdom. If the villagers believe you ordered these harsh measures, if they see you as a tyrant rather than a protector, it would weaken your position fundamentally. A king without the loyalty of his people is vulnerable to challenge, to rebellion, even to assassination. And if multiple regions are suffering simultaneously, if the entire kingdom is in turmoil, it creates an opportunity for someone to step in and present themselves as a savior. Marcus walked to the window, looking out over his fortress and the lands beyond. The snow was falling more heavily now, blanketing everything in white. Elena was right. This was bigger than one corrupt administrator. This was a calculated attack on his rule, using the suffering of innocent people as a weapon. It was brilliant in its cruelty and terrifying in its scope. "Who do you suspect?" he asked, though he had already begun forming his own theories. "Lord Ashford reports directly to Duke Ravencroft, your cousin. Ravencroft has always been ambitious, always felt he had a stronger claim to the throne because his mother was your father's older sister. He's made no secret of his belief that the crown should have passed through the female line, to him rather than to you. If he could engineer a situation where the people rose up against you, where your own nobles questioned your judgment and your fitness to rule, he could position himself as a savior, a better alternative," Marcus finished. "He could claim that he was acting to protect the kingdom from a tyrant, that he was answering the people's call for new leadership. It's brilliant, in a twisted way. And I played right into his hands by leaving for the Northern Territories, by giving him the opportunity to act without my direct oversight." "The diplomatic mission was necessary," Elena said, coming to stand beside him at the window. "You couldn't have known. The Northern alliances are crucial to our security, and the trade agreements you negotiated will benefit the kingdom for years to come. You made the right decision to go. The fault lies with those who betrayed your trust, not with you for trusting them. But I should have been more careful about who I trusted with power in my absence." Marcus turned to face his wife, taking her hands again. They were warmer now, he noticed, and steadier. "Elena, what you've done, the risks you've taken, the people you've helped, the evidence you've gathered, it's nothing short of heroic. You've operated with the skill of a master strategist and the courage of a warrior, but now we need to be even more strategic. If we move against Ashford too quickly, if we arrest him without understanding the full scope of the conspiracy, we might alert Ravencroft and lose our chance to expose everyone involved. We need to think several moves ahead." Elena's eyes lit up with understanding, and Marcus saw the same sharp intelligence that had first attracted him to her. "You want to set a trap." "I want to give them enough rope to hang themselves," Marcus confirmed. "But I'll need your help, and the help of your network of women. They've proven themselves capable of operating in secret, of gathering information without drawing attention. If we can use that network to identify all of Ravencroft's allies, to document the full extent of the conspiracy, then when we move, we can sweep them all up at once." A slow smile spread across Elena's face, transforming her features from worried to determined. "Tell me what you need." Over the next several hours they planned. Marcus would remain away from the fortress, hiding in the private chambers while Elena continued her relief efforts. This would require careful coordination. Servants would need to be sworn to secrecy. Guards would need to be positioned to prevent accidental discovery. And Marcus would need to remain out of sight during daylight hours, when Ashford's spies might be watching. Meanwhile, he would secretly meet with loyal guards and nobles, building his own case against Ashford, while Elena's network continued to gather intelligence. "We need to identify everyone involved," Marcus said, spreading a map of the kingdom across the desk. "Every corrupt administrator, every noble who's benefiting from the scheme, every merchant who's buying stolen goods. We need names, dates, transactions, everything." Elena nodded, her finger tracing routes across the map. "The women in the network have connections throughout the kingdom. Sarah's father controls the Eastern Territories and has contacts in the merchant guilds. Margaret's sister is married to a clerk in Duke Ravencroft's household. Catherine's nephew works in the royal treasury. We can use these connections to gather information without arousing suspicion, and we need to let Ashford believe he still has free reign," Marcus added. "If he thinks I'm still away and you're still helpless to stop him, he'll become bolder. Men like Ashford always overreach when they think they're untouchable. He'll make a mistake, and when he does, we'll be ready." They worked late into the night, developing a comprehensive plan. Elena would continue her relief operations, but now with the added mission of intelligence gathering. The women in her network would be given specific assignments, watching certain individuals, documenting suspicious activities, tracking the movement of goods and money. Marcus would remain hidden but active, meeting secretly with his most trusted advisors to build a legal case that would withstand any challenge. As the candles burned low and the fire reduced to glowing embers, Marcus pulled Elena close once more. "I'm sorry I wasn't here when you needed me." "You're here now," she replied simply, resting her head against his chest. "That's what matters. And Marcus, you need to understand something. I didn't do this because I had to. I did it because I wanted to. Because being queen means more than wearing a crown and sitting on a throne. It means protecting those who cannot protect themselves, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when it means risking everything." "I know," Marcus said softly, stroking her hair. "And that's why you're not just my queen. You're my partner, my equal in all things. I should have made that clearer before I left. I should have ensured that everyone understood you speak with my authority, that your word carries the same weight as mine." "We'll make sure they understand now," Elena said with quiet determination. "When this is over, when we've exposed the conspiracy and restored justice, we'll make changes, real changes that will prevent this from ever happening again." They stood together in the fading light, two people bound by love and duty, planning their next moves in a dangerous game. Outside, the winter wind continued to howl, rattling the windows and piling snow against the fortress walls. But inside the royal chambers, warmth and hope were beginning to spread, like the first hints of spring after a long winter. The next morning, Marcus remained hidden, while Elena went about her usual routines. But now, she wasn't alone in her efforts. Marcus worked behind the scenes, meeting quietly with Captain Morrison, the head of his personal guard, in a storage room deep in the fortress's lower levels. The room was cold and damp, lit only by a single torch, but it was secure and far from any of Ashford's spies. "Your Majesty," Captain Morrison said, his weathered face showing shock and concern. "I had no idea. I've noticed irregularities in the supply reports, discrepancies in the guard rotations, but I attributed them to clerical errors. I should have investigated more thoroughly. I should have questioned why so many messengers were having accidents on the northern road." "Don't blame yourself," Marcus said, placing a hand on the older man's shoulder. Morrison had served his father and had taught Marcus himself the arts of war and leadership. Ashford was careful to cover his tracks, and he had help from people we trusted. But now we're going to use his own methods against him. I need you to identify which guards are loyal to the crown and which might be reporting to Ashford." Morrison nodded grimly. "I can do that. There are men I've had my doubts about. Guards who seem to have more money than their wages would explain. Men who ask too many questions about the Queen's activities. I'll compile a list." Marcus also met with Lord Blackwood, a silver-haired nobleman who had served Marcus's father for decades. They met in the fortress chapel, a place where privacy could be maintained under the guise of prayer. The old lord listened to Marcus's account with growing horror, his hands gripping the back of a pew until his knuckles turned white. "If Duke Ravencroft is indeed behind this, we'll need to move carefully," Lord Blackwood said, his voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. "He has allies among the nobility, men who might be swayed by promises of power or wealth. Some of them are good men who don't realize they're being manipulated. Others are opportunists who would support anyone they think might win. We need to identify which is which. Then we identify those allies and neutralize them," Marcus replied. "But first, we need to catch Ashford in an act so blatant, so undeniable, that even his supporters cannot defend him. We need evidence that will stand up in any court before any judge." The opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days after Marcus's return, one of Elena's network members, a young servant girl named Lucy who worked in the fortress kitchens, brought urgent news. She had been delivering wine to the cellar when she overheard voices coming from a storage room that was supposed to be empty. Curious and remembering the Queen's instructions to report anything unusual, she had hidden behind a stack of barrels and listened. Lucy arrived at Elena's chambers breathless and frightened, her young face pale with fear and excitement. Elena had been meeting with Margaret and Sarah, reviewing the latest intelligence reports, when the girl burst in. "Your Majesty," Lucy gasped. "I've heard something important." Elena immediately dismissed the other women and drew Lucy to sit by the fire, giving her time to catch her breath. Marcus, hidden in an adjoining room, listened through the partially open door. "Take your time," Elena said gently. "Tell me everything you heard." "It was Lord Ashford," Lucy said, her hands trembling as she accepted a cup of warm cider from Elena. "He was meeting with several men in the wine cellar. I recognized some of them. Merchants from the Eastern Territories, men who've been buying supplies from the fortress. They were planning something terrible, Your Majesty." "What were they planning?" Elena asked, her voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "They're going to sell the kingdom's grain reserves. Not just the excess, but the emergency stores. The grain that's supposed to last us through the winter if the harvest fails. Lord Ashford said they would sell it to foreign buyers at inflated prices. He said the profits would be split between him and his patron, though he didn't mention a name. But Your Majesty, if they take those stores, people will starve. Not just a few families, but entire villages." Marcus felt his blood run cold. The emergency grain reserves were sacred, maintained at great expense specifically to prevent famine. To sell them for personal profit was not just corruption, it was mass murder. Elena's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "When is this sale supposed to happen?" "Tomorrow night, Your Majesty. A convoy is coming from the Eastern Territories. They're going to load the grain under cover of darkness and transport it across the border before anyone realizes it's gone. Lord Ashford said that by the time the king returns and discovers the theft, it will be too late to stop it. He said the kingdom would be so weakened by hunger and unrest that it would be ripe for new leadership." Elena stood and began to pace, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. "Lucy, you've done well. Very well. But you must tell no one else about this. Go back to your duties and act as if nothing has happened. Can you do that?" The girl nodded, her fear giving way to determination. "Yes, Your Majesty. I won't let you down." After Lucy left, Marcus emerged from his hiding place. Elena turned to him, and he saw in her eyes the same cold fury he felt burning in his own chest. "This is it," she said. "This is the evidence we need. If we can catch them in the act of loading the grain, if we can arrest them with the stolen goods in their possession, there will be no way for them to deny their crimes." Marcus nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "Can you position your network to watch the warehouse without alerting Ashford's men?" "Yes. The women can blend in anywhere. Servants, washerwomen, merchants' wives. No one pays attention to women going about their daily business. We can have eyes on every entrance to the warehouse." "Good. I'll speak with Captain Morrison. We'll need loyal guards positioned nearby, ready to move on my signal. But we have to be careful. If Ashford suspects a trap, he'll call off the sale, and we'll lose our chance." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Elena's network of women spread throughout the fortress and surrounding areas, taking up positions that would allow them to observe without being observed. Some set up washing stations near the warehouse. Others established themselves as vendors selling hot food and drink to travelers. To any casual observer, they were simply women going about their normal activities. But each one was carefully positioned to see and report on any suspicious activity. Captain Morrison selected his most trusted men, veterans who had served under Marcus's father, and whose loyalty was beyond question. These guards were positioned in groups of 3 or 4, disguised as merchants or travelers, close enough to respond quickly, but not so close as to arouse suspicion. Marcus himself prepared for confrontation. He dressed in simple, dark clothing, that would allow him to move unseen through the fortress. He checked his sword, ensuring the blade was sharp and the balance perfect. He had no desire for violence, but he knew that cornering desperate men could lead to desperate actions. As the sun began to set on the following evening, casting long shadows across the fortress grounds, Marcus took up position in a storage building adjacent to the grain warehouse. From here, he had a clear view of the main doors and could see anyone approaching. Elena insisted on accompanying him, despite his protests. "We're partners, remember?" she said firmly, strapping a small dagger to her belt. "I've been fighting this battle for months. I'm not sitting out the final confrontation." They waited in silence as darkness fell. The temperature dropped rapidly, and their breath formed clouds in the cold air. Marcus could feel the tension radiating from Elena, could see the way her hand kept moving to the hilt of her dagger. He reached over and took her other hand, squeezing gently. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Prouder than I've ever been of anyone." She turned to him, and even in the dim light, he could see tears glistening in her eyes. "We're going to make this right. For all those families. For all those children who've suffered. We're going to bring justice." Around midnight, they heard the sound of approaching wagons. Marcus tensed, peering through a gap in the wooden wall. Several large wagons pulled by teams of horses emerged from the darkness, moving slowly toward the warehouse. The drivers were careful to muffle the horses' hooves in the wagon wheels, wrapping them in cloth to reduce noise. Minutes later, Lord Ashford arrived with a group of men. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the administrator's satisfied expression. Ashford looked pleased with himself, confident that his plan was proceeding perfectly. He barked orders to his men, who began unlocking the warehouse doors. "This is the last shipment," Ashford said to a well-dressed merchant who had arrived with the wagons. His voice carried clearly in the cold night air. "After this, we'll have moved enough resources to cripple the kingdom's food supply. When spring comes and the people realize there's no grain for planting, when they understand that starvation is inevitable, they'll be desperate for change. They'll welcome any new leadership that promises to save them. And Duke Ravencroft will be ready to step in," the merchant replied with a cruel smile. "A generous patron, your Duke. This arrangement has been quite profitable for all of us. Though I must say I'm surprised the Queen hasn't interfered. I heard she's been distributing supplies to the villages." Ashford laughed, a harsh sound that made Marcus's blood boil. "The Queen is a woman playing at politics. She has no real power, no authority to challenge me. She's been using her dowry stores to feed a few families, thinking she's making a difference. She has no idea of the scale of what we're doing. By the time she realizes the truth, it will be far too late." Marcus had heard enough. He stepped out of the shadows, throwing back his hood. "I'm afraid your assessment of the Queen is quite wrong, Ashford, and your plan ends tonight." Ashford's face went white as snow, his confident expression crumbling into shock and fear. "Your Majesty, we were just... This isn't what it looks like. Really." Marcus's voice was cold as winter steel, carrying the authority of a king and the fury of a man who had seen his people betrayed. "Because it looks like treason. It looks like you've been systematically stealing from my people, forging my orders, and conspiring with my enemies to undermine my rule. It looks like you're in the process of selling the kingdom's emergency grain reserves for personal profit, knowing that doing so will condemn thousands of people to starvation." Guards emerged from all directions, surrounding Ashford and his men. Captain Morrison led the charge, his sword drawn and his face set in grim determination. The merchant who had been speaking with Ashford tried to run, but was quickly tackled by 2 guards. The wagon drivers, realizing they were caught, threw down their reins and raised their hands in surrender. Ashford looked around desperately, seeking an escape route, but found none. His hand moved toward the sword at his belt, but Marcus was faster. In 3 quick strides, he closed the distance between them and pressed his own blade against Ashford's throat. "I wouldn't," Marcus said quietly. "You've committed enough crimes tonight. Don't add attempted assault on the king to the list." "You have no proof," Ashford sputtered, even as guards moved to restrain him. "These are legitimate business transactions. You can't prove anything." "On the contrary," Elena said, stepping forward with her ledger. Marcus felt a surge of pride as she moved with confidence and authority, every inch a queen. "We have extensive proof. Every illegal taxation, every forged document, every threat made against innocent people, all documented in meticulous detail. I've spent months building this case, gathering testimony from dozens of witnesses, collecting physical evidence of your crimes. And now, thanks to your own words tonight, we have confirmation of your conspiracy with Duke Ravencroft." She opened the ledger and began to read, her voice clear and strong. "On the 15th of October, you collected 300 bushels of wheat from the Henderson family, claiming it was the king's order. The actual tax owed was 100 bushels. On the 20th of October, you threatened Thomas Morrison with imprisonment if he didn't produce 50 iron tools within a week, an impossible quota that forced him to work until he collapsed from exhaustion. On the 3rd of November, you intercepted a messenger I sent to the king and had him beaten and threatened. Shall I continue?" Ashford's expression shifted from panic to rage. His face flushed red, and spittle flew from his lips as he shouted, You've been interfering all along. I knew those supplies were disappearing, but I couldn't prove it was you. You had no right. You're just a woman, just a queen," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through Ashford's tirade like a blade. "Just the woman who rules beside me, who speaks with my authority, and who has more courage and intelligence in her smallest finger than you have in your entire corrupt body. You made a fatal error, Ashford. You underestimated her because she's a woman. You thought her compassion was weakness, her kindness was naivety. But while you were busy congratulating yourself on your cleverness, she was building a case so strong, so thoroughly documented, that no court in the land could ignore it." Captain Morrison stepped forward with chains, the iron links clinking ominously in the cold night air. "Lord Ashford, you are under arrest for treason, theft, fraud, conspiracy against the crown, and attempted murder. Your accomplices will be arrested as well. You will be held in the fortress dungeon until such time as you can be tried before a court of nobles." As the guards led Ashford away, still protesting his innocence, Marcus turned to address the growing crowd. Word had spread quickly through the fortress, and people had begun to gather. Servants, guards, villagers who had been drawn by the commotion. Marcus saw fear and hope warring on their faces, saw the desperate need to believe that justice might finally be served. "People of Blackthorn," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Silence fell as everyone turned to listen. "You have suffered under false orders, cruel taxation, and deliberate cruelty. You have endured hardships that no subject of this kingdom should ever have to face. I stand before you now to say that these actions were not taken in my name or with my knowledge. Lord Ashford betrayed his position, betrayed your trust, and betrayed everything this kingdom stands for. But someone else fought for you when I could not." He reached for Elena's hand, drawing her forward to stand beside him. She tried to resist, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but Marcus held firm. "Your queen, Elena, risked everything to protect you. While I was away, believing my kingdom was in capable hands, she discovered the truth of Ashford's corruption. She could have done nothing. It would have been safer, easier, more comfortable to simply wait for my return. But that's not who she is. Instead, she used her own resources to feed the hungry, organized a network of brave women to distribute supplies in secret, and gathered evidence of the crimes being committed against you. She worked tirelessly, at great personal risk, to ensure that no family went hungry while she had the power to help them." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Marcus saw tears streaming down many faces, tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope restored. Women began to call out Elena's name, and soon the entire crowd was chanting it. Elena stood beside him, her hand firmly in his, and he felt a surge of pride and love so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. The grain that Ashford attempted to steal tonight will be returned to the royal stores, Marcus continued when the crowd had quieted. Additionally, I am ordering that the emergency reserves be opened immediately to provide relief to any family in need. The excessive taxes that were collected under false pretenses will be returned or credited against future obligations, and I am establishing a new council, one that will include representatives from the villages and towns, to ensure that the voices of all our people are heard in matters of governance. More cheers erupted, and Marcus had to raise his hand for silence. But the fight is not over. Lord Ashford was not acting alone. He was part of a larger conspiracy, one that reaches into the highest levels of nobility. In the coming days and weeks, we will root out every conspirator, every corrupt official, every person who put their own greed above the welfare of the kingdom. And we will ensure that such betrayal can never happen again. In the days that followed, the full extent of the conspiracy became clear. Ashford, facing execution for treason, provided detailed testimony implicating Duke Ravenscroft and several other nobles. He revealed a network of corruption that extended across multiple territories, involving dozens of administrators, merchants, and even some military officers. The conspiracy had been years in the making, carefully planned and executed with the goal of weakening Marcus's rule and positioning Ravenscroft as a viable alternative. Marcus moved swiftly to arrest the conspirators. Duke Ravenscroft was taken into custody while attempting to flee to the northern territories. Several other nobles were arrested in their own estates, their protests of innocence falling on deaf ears as the evidence against them mounted. The merchants who had been buying stolen goods were tracked down and charged with receiving stolen property and conspiracy. The trials were swift but fair. Marcus insisted on proper legal proceedings, even for those who had betrayed him most deeply. He wanted no one to be able to claim that justice had not been served, that the accused had not been given every opportunity to defend themselves. But the evidence was overwhelming, and one by one, the conspirators were found guilty. Duke Ravenscroft, as the architect of the conspiracy, was sentenced to death. His estates were seized and distributed among loyal nobles and the families who had suffered most under the corrupt taxation. Other conspirators received sentences ranging from execution to imprisonment to exile, depending on the severity of their crimes and their level of involvement. But Marcus's focus was not solely on punishment. He was determined to implement reforms that would prevent such corruption from taking root again. He established the council he had promised, bringing representatives from villages and towns to the fortress to participate in governance. These representatives had real power, the authority to raise concerns, to question policies, and to vote on matters that affected their communities. He also gave Elena an official position as royal advocate, with the authority to investigate complaints and ensure that the king's orders were being properly implemented. She was given her own staff, her own budget, and the explicit backing of the crown. Any official who refused to cooperate with her investigations would answer directly to the king. "You've changed the kingdom," Lord Blackwood remarked one evening as they reviewed the new governance structure. They were in Marcus's private study, surrounded by maps and documents outlining the reforms. "These changes are unprecedented. There are those who say you're giving too much power to common people, that you're undermining the traditional hierarchy. Then those people can voice their concerns in the new council," Marcus replied, not looking up from the document he was reviewing. The traditional hierarchy failed. It allowed corruption to flourish because there were no checks on the power of administrators like Ashford. These reforms create accountability. They ensure that power cannot be abused without consequences. "And the Queen's position?" Blackwood asked carefully. "There are some who question whether a woman should have such authority." Marcus looked up, his eyes hard. "Then those people can question me directly," Elena saved this kingdom while I was away. She showed more courage, more intelligence, and more leadership than most of the men who claim to be qualified for power. Anyone who questions her authority is questioning my judgment, and I will not tolerate it." Blackwood smiled, a rare expression on his usually stern face. "I'm glad to hear it, Your Majesty. For what it's worth, I believe the Queen is exactly what this kingdom needs. She brings a perspective that has been missing, a concern for the welfare of common people that too many nobles have forgotten." As winter deepened and snow continued to blanket the fortress, life began to return to normal, or rather, to a new normal. The villages recovered, families rebuilt their stores, and trust in the crown was gradually restored. The network of women that Elena had organized didn't disband. Instead, it evolved into an official organization dedicated to helping those in need. It was funded by the crown and supported by volunteers from all levels of society, from noblewomen to servants to merchants' wives. One evening, as Marcus and Elena sat by the fire in their chambers, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. The flames cast dancing shadows across her face, and Marcus was struck once again by how beautiful she was, not just in appearance, but in spirit and character. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come home early that day?" she asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think you would have continued fighting, continued protecting our people, until I returned." "You didn't need me to be strong, Elena. You already were. You had already built the network, gathered the evidence, and positioned yourself to act when the opportunity arose. My early return simply accelerated the timeline." "But I'm stronger with you beside me," she replied, reaching for his hand. "Just as you're stronger with me beside you. That's what partnership means. It's not about one person being dependent on the other. It's about two people choosing to face the world together, supporting each other, complementing each other's strengths, and compensating for each other's weaknesses." "Speaking of which," Marcus said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small box. He had been waiting for the right moment to give this to her, and somehow, this quiet evening by the fire felt perfect. "I had this made for you." Elena opened the box to find a ring, not ornate or covered in jewels, but simple and elegant, crafted from silver and gold intertwined. On the inside was an inscription: "My queen, my partner, my equal." "It's perfect," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears as she slipped it onto her finger. The metal gleamed in the firelight, the silver and gold bands twisted together in an unbreakable bond. "You saved the kingdom," Marcus said seriously, taking both her hands in his. "Not with armies or weapons, but with compassion, intelligence, and courage. You showed me what true leadership looks like. You showed me that power without compassion is tyranny, that authority without accountability is corruption. This ring is a symbol of that, a reminder that you are not just my wife, but my co-ruler in every sense. Your voice carries the same weight as mine. Your decisions have the same authority. We rule together, as equals." Elena leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind howl outside. The fortress stood strong against the winter night, sheltering the people within its walls. And inside, two leaders, a king and a queen, planned for a future built on justice, compassion, and partnership. The story of how Queen Elena saved the kingdom while the king was away became legend. Bards sang songs about the brave women who formed a secret network to feed the hungry. Children grew up hearing tales of the queen who risked everything for her people. And in the villages and towns throughout the realm, when people spoke of their rulers, they spoke not of a king who commanded, but of a partnership that served. Years later, when Marcus and Elena were old and their children had grown to take on responsibilities of their own, people would still ask about that winter. The winter when the Alpha King returned to the fortress early, and his Luna whispered, "Stay quiet." The story had been embellished over time, as all stories are, but the core truth remained. A queen had seen injustice and refused to accept it, had seen suffering and refused to ignore it, had seen corruption and refused to tolerate it. Elena would smile when asked about those days, her face lined with age, but her eyes still bright with the fire that had driven her to act. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to watch, when to act, and when to trust the people around you to do what's right, she would say. I didn't save the kingdom alone. I had help from dozens of brave women who risked everything to do what was right. They are the real heroes of that story. But those who had been there, who had seen her organize the network and gather the evidence and stand up to corruption despite the risks, knew better. They knew that while Elena had indeed had help, she had been the catalyst, the leader, the one who had turned individual acts of compassion into a coordinated campaign of resistance. Marcus never forgot the lesson he learned that winter day, when he stood silent in his own chambers, watching his wife lead a revolution of compassion. He had thought he understood leadership, had believed that his military victories and political acumen made him a good king. But Elena had shown him that true leadership required more than strength and strategy. It required empathy, the ability to see beyond the abstract concepts of governance to the real people whose lives were affected by every decision. In the years that followed, Marcus and Elena ruled together in a true partnership. They established schools throughout the kingdom, ensuring that both boys and girls received education. They reformed the legal system to provide equal access to justice regardless of social class. They created programs to support widows and orphans, to provide medical care to the poor, to ensure that no one in their kingdom went hungry or homeless. Their children grew up watching this partnership, learning that leadership was about service rather than power, that authority came with responsibility, and that the measure of a ruler was not in the size of their army or the wealth of their treasury, but in the welfare of their people. The grain stores were never depleted again. Marcus established strict protocols for their management, with multiple layers of oversight to prevent any single person from having unchecked access. The emergency reserves were regularly audited, and representatives from the villages were included in the inspection teams to ensure transparency. The villages prospered under the new system of governance. With representatives on the council, the common people had a voice in decisions that affected their lives. Taxes were fair and transparent, collected by officials who knew they would be held accountable for any abuse of power. The roads were maintained, the bridges repaired, and the markets flourished with trade. And the women who had risked everything to help their neighbors were honored with positions of respect and authority. Margaret became the head of the new charitable organization, overseeing the distribution of aid throughout the kingdom. Catherine was appointed as an advisor on food security, ensuring that the kingdom's stores were always adequate to meet the people's needs. Sarah took on a role in the diplomatic corps, using her intelligence and connections to strengthen alliances with neighboring kingdoms. Lucy, the young servant girl who had overheard Ashford's plans, was given a position in the Royal Advocate's office, where her sharp ears and quick mind proved invaluable in uncovering corruption and abuse. She became one of Elena's most trusted assistants, eventually rising to become the second Royal Advocate when Elena's duties as queen made it impossible for her to personally investigate every complaint. In the Great Hall of Blackthorn Fortress, a tapestry was commissioned to commemorate that winter. It took 3 years to complete, woven by the finest craftsmen in the kingdom. The tapestry showed not a king on a throne or a battle won, but a circle of women passing bundles of grain from hand to hand, with Queen Elena at the center. Her hand was raised in that gesture that had saved them all, a call for silence, for patience, for trust that the truth would prevail. Around the border of the tapestry, the names of all the women who had participated in the network were embroidered in silver thread. It was important to Elena that they be remembered, that their courage be recognized for generations to come. And at the bottom of the tapestry, words were embroidered in gold thread. The strength of a kingdom lies not in its armies, but in the courage of those who serve its people. This became the motto of the Blackthorn dynasty, passed down through generations. It was inscribed on the gates of the fortress, woven into the family banners, and taught to every child in the kingdom's schools. It served as a constant reminder that true power came from compassion, that real strength lay in partnership, and that sometimes the most important thing a leader could do was listen to the whisper that said, "Stay quiet," and trust that what followed would change everything. The fortress still stands today, centuries later, a testament to the power of partnership and the importance of justice. Visitors come from across the land to see the tapestry, to hear the story of the queen who saved her people, and to learn the lessons that Marcus and Elena taught through their actions. In the royal archives, Elena's ledger is preserved under glass, its pages yellowed with age, but its message still clear. Scholars study it as an example of meticulous documentation and strategic thinking. Leaders from other kingdoms come to examine it, learning from Elena's methods and applying them in their own lands. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of that winter is not found in tapestries or archives or official records. It's found in the culture of the kingdom itself, in the way people treat each other, in the expectation that leaders will serve rather than command, in the understanding that everyone, regardless of gender, class, or birth, has value and deserves to be heard. The women of the kingdom, in particular, benefited from Elena's example. She had proven that women could lead, could strategize, could make difficult decisions, and take calculated risks. She had shown that compassion was not weakness, but strength, that caring for others was not a distraction from governance, but its very purpose. In the generations that followed, women took on roles that had previously been denied to them. They became administrators and judges, merchants and scholars, military officers and diplomats. And when anyone questioned whether women were capable of such responsibilities, they were reminded of Queen Elena, who had saved a kingdom while the king was away. Marcus and Elena ruled for 40 years, a period that became known as the Golden Age of Blackthorn. When they finally passed the crown to their eldest daughter, another reform that shocked the traditional nobility but was welcomed by the people, the kingdom was stronger, more prosperous, and more just than it had ever been. On their final night together, old and tired but still deeply in love, Marcus and Elena sat once more by the fire in their chambers. The same chairs, the same fireplace, the same view out the window, though they themselves had changed so much over the years. "Do you have any regrets?" Marcus asked, his voice rough with age. Elena thought for a long moment, her hand, still wearing the ring he had given her all those years ago, resting in his. "Only one," she said finally. "I regret that it took a crisis for us to realize how the kingdom should be governed. I wish we had implemented these reforms from the beginning, that we hadn't needed corruption and suffering to show us the way." "But we learned," Marcus replied, "and we changed. And because we changed, the kingdom changed. That's all anyone can do. Learn from their mistakes and try to do better." "Do you think it will last?" Elena asked. "The reforms, the council, the equality we've tried to establish? Or will it all fade away after we're gone?" Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "It will last because we've built it into the foundation of the kingdom. It's not just laws and policies. It's culture, expectation, shared values. Our children believe in these principles because they've seen them work, and they'll teach their children, who will teach theirs. Change doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't last unless it becomes part of who people are." Elena smiled, resting her head on his shoulder, as she had done countless times over the years. "We did good work, didn't we?" "We did great work," Marcus corrected. "Together." Outside, snow was falling once again, blanketing the fortress in white. But inside, the fire burned warm and bright, a symbol of the warmth and light that Marcus and Elena had brought to their kingdom. And in the villages and towns throughout the realm, families sat around their own fires, telling stories of the king and queen who had ruled with wisdom and compassion, who had proven that true strength came not from power, but from partnership. The story of that winter, When the Alpha King returned to the fortress early and his Luna whispered, "Stay quiet," became more than just a tale of political intrigue and corruption exposed. It became a story about the power of compassion, the importance of courage, and the truth that real leadership requires both strength and kindness, both strategy and empathy. It became a story about partnership, about two people who chose to face the world together, who supported and challenged each other, who brought out the best in one another. It became a story about how love and trust can be the foundation, not just of a marriage, but of a kingdom. And it became a story about how sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay quiet and watch, trusting that the person you love will show you something you never knew you needed to see.